Good afternoon and a very warm welcome on behalf of the European Alliance for Transformative Therapies, known as Transform for short, MEP interest group, to this online discussion on Fit for ATMPs, creating an EU regulatory framework that works for transformative therapies. My name is Jackie Davis. I will have the privilege of moderating our discussions this afternoon, and we're going to have a series of short presentations to set the context for our discussions, and then some quick-fire panels on some of the key issues that we need to address in relation to the EU regulatory framework. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before I introduce our host today. If you would like to ask a question, I should warn you, as I say, it's going to be a bit quick-fire, but I do hope to squeeze some of your questions in if you have them. Please use the chat box and please be as brief as possible so that I can see what you want to know and who you want to know it from at a glance. If you would like to tweet about what you are hearing this afternoon, and we do encourage you to do so, please use the hashtag MEPs for ATMPs. And just to mention that this event is being recorded and will be put on the Transform website tomorrow. So I'll tell you more about the program and who we're going to hear from a little bit later on, but I'm now delighted to give the floor to the co-chair of the Transform MEP interest group, Andrzej Gnotek, MEP, to launch proceedings formally and tell you a bit more about why we're here today. Andrzej, great to have you with us, and over to you, sir.
Many thanks, Jackie, for the floor, and a very warm good afternoon to all of you online. As a co-chair of the Transform MEP interest group, it is my great pleasure to welcome you on this year's second session of our MEP interest group with a clear headline: how to shape the EU regulatory framework to ensure the patient access to the ATMPs. I'm very delighted to announce that today we will have a number of experts in the field, including colleagues from the European Commission and the European Medicine Agency. Thank you very much for joining us together. In recent times, we have put forward the Transform policy ask on a regulatory framework for ATMPs, and those tasks are now fully available on the Transform Alliance websites. Feel free to see, feel free to share. As we all know, that transformative therapies are modern, high-tech therapies, however, also a very complex one, and they deserve and also need a special regulatory framework to address, firstly, the patient's unmet needs, but also specific safety patient requirements, and last not least, to create a specific innovative but also motivating environment for incentives and for private investments to explore development of further ATMPs in order to give curement treatments to our patients, especially with rare or neglected diseases. Ahead of us is a huge discussion on number of pharma legislations. We have, for example, the health data space, or we will have this blood and tissue and cell regulations. And with those, we are about to debate on a number of bottlenecks and potential issues, which we have identified in our previous work. For example, the evidence generation for small patient groups, or for example, how to improve the classification and changes in implementation. So all these and similar will be the question marks of today, and I will be looking forward for a very fruitful and result-oriented discussion, because as usually the outcomes of today's meeting will be used not only, but first of all, for my colleague MEPs to do the best job possible in the upcoming legislative work. So let me thank you for being here with us today, and I'm looking forward for a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Andre. And as you say, the second in the series, an in-person event to come in mid-October. It will be lovely to meet everyone in person finally at that point. But we have a lot to discuss this afternoon as we consider the crucial question of how do we ensure that we really have a regulatory framework that is agile, flexible, that really is fit for purpose and proportionate in order to seize all the opportunities these therapies have to offer. Lots to discuss this afternoon. We're going to have a couple of short introductory remarks from Alliance members. Delighted to give the floor first to Simone Bosselli, EU Public Affairs Director at Eurordis, the umbrella association representing rare disease patients in Europe. Simone, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and it's nice to see you all again, even if you're still online. And thank you for inviting me to give a very short introduction to today's meeting. I was looking back into my notes, and already back at the beginning of the term of this European Commission, we, as Eurordis, recommended to look at the robustness of the ATMP framework as part of the pharmaceutical strategy. And I'm very glad today to be with you to have in this meeting where we can have a proper look, a comprehensive look at all of the different regulatory aspects that are touching upon ATMPs. As you know, Jackie, and people online, advanced therapeutical medicine products such as gene and cell therapy holds great promise for people living with rare diseases as they target the genetic and root causes of their diseases. And we've seen, particularly since 2017, an increase in the availability, at least at marketing authorization level, of these therapies. And I must say that the regulatory framework has worked well, particularly when we look at PRIME, that has conducted and made available a number of therapies that are clearly transformative. However, whilst it is important that these recommendations are coming out today to look at the regulatory framework by taking into account the different aspects of the pathway, it is important not to lose sight of the overall ecosystem that goes before and after regulatory authorization. In terms of the recommendation of today, I would like to focus particularly on 3 points. One is that in this process that it will likely to kickstart with the adoption of the proposal for regulation on blood, cell and tissues, but it has already in fact started with the European Health Data Space and will continue with the pharmaceutical package, that we apply consistently the lesson learned from the COVID-19, particularly when it comes to the effectiveness and uptake of different as well as important ways of conducting clinical trials, as MEP Notek has mentioned before, particularly with small population, but also on novel trials, as well as looking at the potential exemption on GMOs for those clinical trials to make it consistent across Europe. And that takes me to the second point in the recommendation to create a level playing field in terms of particularly when looking at the implementation of the hospital exemption, which remains particularly an important feature when we look at very, very, very small population, but is implemented in a way that is not guaranteeing a level playing field, and that needs to be necessarily addressed. And finally, but not lastly, about patient involvement. Patient involvement throughout the regulatory pathway has been at the cornerstone of Eurordis activities since the introduction of the OMP regulation, and we have created and gathered experience since the 2000s. And I'm very glad that this is included, but we need to go even further to ensure, one, the patient engagement in regulatory pathways is consistent, particularly starting from the clinical trials, ethics committees further downstream, but also later on in HTA. And this morning, Czech Health Minister Dvoracek provided a great example of how the Czech Republic has trained a number of patient representatives to be effectively and meaningfully involved in these decisions, but also needs to go beyond the regulatory itself. First, to recognize the patient drive development of therapies that need to be involved consistently and early with sponsor, be them academia or industry, to design clinical trials in the appropriate way, that they are consulted and listened to when it comes to definition of criteria for those centers of excellence where these therapies will be involved, and continue to maintain a favorable environment to allow them to voice concern, proposals, etc.
Thank you very much indeed, Simone. And an issue we will come back to, I assure you, later on in our discussions. Now delighted to give the floor to Dr. Alexander Natz, Secretary General of the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs, EU COPE. A very warm welcome, Alexander, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here again and to talk about the regulatory framework, which is especially important in the broader context of ATMPs. What we need is a robust, stable, and appropriate regulatory framework that plays an important role in ensuring that Europe remains competitive from the global perspective, and really remains a territory which is attractive for companies to launch their ATMPs, and that's really important. And really, these discussions which we're having here today are technical discussions, but they have very concrete outcomes and implications, and they are very important. So I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to talk today about the regulatory framework. And overall, I would say that we definitely have an agency with EMA, which is globally renowned, a regulatory body which has been successfully reviewed a number of ATMPs in the last years. And in many cases, companies have launched their therapies first in Europe. We shouldn't forget about that. And that's a great outcome. It's a great outcome because we have a very competitive regulatory agency named EMA, European Medicines Agency. We have seen, to be concrete here, 19 products launched until the end of January 2020, which are ATMPs. I'm at least aware of 5 of them which have been launched first in Europe, and I think that's a success, and that's important. It's important that we spell that out very clearly, that whatever comes in the pharmaceutical framework takes into consideration that we have been really competitive when it comes to launching ATMPs in Europe in the last 10 years. There was not so much happening in the first 10 years of ATMP legislation because probably technology was not advanced enough. I'd also like to mention that EMA has conducted more than 500 scientific advice meetings on ATMPs. That's also very good. So we see that companies come first to talk to EMA how they can bring their products to European patients. Again, a very successful point here, and a very important point. EMA has demonstrated exceptional capabilities and flexibilities and adapted to changing technologies to ensure that these innovative therapies could contribute to be assessed and made available to European patients again. I think Simona mentioned before the PRIME concept, which has been developed. We also have to mention here that the conditional marketing authorization is a very successful concept, not just to bring ATMPs. It has also been used in the vaccines to be competitive, to have products quickly, very often on the basis of phase 2 data, and then the company is obliged to bring in additional data later on a yearly basis, and that has really been very successful. Regrettably, over the past decades, the number of clinical trials and research in ATMPs has increasingly been taken over in the US and China. We had 323 clinical trials conducted in ATMPs in Europe until the end of 2019, but that is going down, and I think that's a warning sign that companies feel sometimes more attractive from other territories in the world. So we shouldn't take for granted that these clinical trials are conducted in the EU. They are only conducted in the EU if the regulatory framework is right. And overall, we have a good setting here. And I have a little bit of an ask here when it comes to the general pharmaceutical legislation, which is currently under review. It is really important that the Commission will have a future-proof system or maintain a future-proof system for the regulatory framework. That's really important, and the regulatory environment is needed that supports the EMA and provides them with a framework to leverage alternative data sources such as real-world evidence to continue to evaluate those therapies. Last point I'd like to make here, Jackie, is the BTC legislation. We're going to hear something about this. We heard that the Commission is about to publish a draft in the mid of July this year. It's an important piece of legislation when it comes to ATMPs because very often blood, tissue, and cells are the starting materials for cell and gene therapies and tissue engineering products. So it's really important that we got it right also from the perspective of ATMPs when it comes to this basic piece of legislation. Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to a constructive conversation and to explore solutions and opportunities together here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alexander. And we will indeed in just a moment be hearing more about the general pharmaceutical legislation and specifically about the blood, tissue and cells proposals, which you just mentioned. And we will be delving into both of those issues in our panels with an exchange between our MEPs who are with us today and some of our experts. But I'm now delighted to welcome Stefan van der Spiegel. Stefan is Head of Sector for Health Innovation in the Directorate General for Health and Food Safety, better known to those of us in Brussels as DG Santé in the European Commission. Stefan, a very warm welcome. Over to you. I know you have some slides. I don't know, Stefan, however, we were hoping you might be able to stay on to join us in a couple of those panels later on. Can you stay with us this afternoon in case anyone has any questions? Or do you have to dash?
No, I'll be happy to do that, Jackie.
Thank you so much. I might also bring you in on the hospital exemption as well as on blood, tissue and cells, if that's okay with you. Anyway,
I can try to give my part and views, but I'm not. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. You are wonderful. Let me hand over to you now to tell us a little bit more about the review of the general pharmaceutical legislation and the BTC directive. Over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. So while the slides are coming on the full screen, and Jackie, just practically, I don't have a remote link to move the site, so I will.
Right, I think we can do that for you. There is the first one, so we should be fine.
Good. So I'll use the time to briefly explain you the ecosystem that the BTC sector is offering for ATMPs, then our blood tissue cell legal framework and why we're going to change it, and then particular focus on the borderline with pharma and ATMP, and then also bringing a couple of messages from my pharma colleagues. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what are substances of human origin? It's all those therapies that you know that can be taken out of the human body and used to recycle as a therapy for patients. That can be blood components for surgery trauma, that can be stem cells of blood for blood cancers. So many replacement tissues like for blindness, burn wounds. It can also be medically assisted reproductive technologies for infertility. And for completeness, I've also mentioned here solid organ transplants, kidney, liver, but that's out of the scope of discussion today. Next, please. Maybe just important to underline that those therapies are offered across the EU by about 5,000 authorized centers. So it's small scale local centers treating local patients. And typically that are public services, academic hospitals, and not-for-profit sectors. We're, for example, often talking about the Red Cross in our sector. Sometimes there are local for-profit actors, in particular in the IVF sector. Next, please. So all those substances have one thing in common. They follow a flow from a donor body to a recipient body, and there's different steps in there. I'm not going to explain them each one to you, and I'm sure some of you are, for example, blood donors and will know some of those steps. Next, please. But what I think needs to be underlined that within that setting already there is continuous innovation happening, and that innovation really impacts and improves outcomes for patients. I've put a couple of examples here just to mention is, for example, better conservation technologies for gametes, which really can have a very strong positive impact on pregnancy rates for infertility problems. And also last year, you might have heard that there was a plasma-based therapy, convalescent plasma, that has been explored and can be used for COVID patients, in particular immunosuppressed COVID patients. So that are therapies within the SOHO framework that are continuously developing. Next, please. And with those developments, the SOHO sector is actually, with those innovations, is also offering an ecosystem for advanced therapy medicinal products. If you look at where the advanced therapy medicinal products are and where they come from, they're often that same, we're talking about the same actors. And here I give you a report of the European Society on Bone Marrow Transplantation, and they report every year the activities of all their centers across many countries, and those centers are really typically the authorized tissue establishments. And they also increasingly are, for example, reporting on ATMPs that are collected, applied by them, and in several cases also being prepared by them. For example, the CAR-Ts, where they're reporting a significant number of patients being treated with those therapies in their setting. Next, please. And also, if you look at tissue engineered products, many of them are coming originally from the tissue establishments. We're talking about like ChondroSelect to repair knees, or Holoclar for some blindness diseases. Next, please. Yeah, that's the other way. Yes. So what our EU framework is doing is actually setting safety quality standards for all of those steps that those substances are to taken from a donor body to a recipient body. Next. And that includes requirements for the professionals handling those therapies in clinics and public services, making sure they work with the right donors, they test everybody for HIV, hepatitis, quality requirements on how to handle the substances. Next, please. Also includes requirements on the national competent authorities. In every country, there's one authority that needs to oversee, oversight, inspect, authorize all those professional sites. And in many countries, that is actually exactly the same authority than the pharma authorities. In France, we're working with ANSM, Agence de Biomedicine. In Germany, it's the Paul Ehrlich Institute. Next, please. And there's a third level of requirements in the framework. That's on us as European Commission to really coordinate and support the whole sector and the authorities. Next, please. And important to highlight those first steps in that chain from donor body to recipient body, which contain in the donation itself, the testing of the donor, the collection, procurement, those steps will also always be applicable for substance of human origin that become later on pharmaceuticals, and that can be ATMPs, but that can be, and actually a more important sector, plasma-derived medicinal products, where I know also some MEPs have a strong interest. Next, please. Next, you can couple of times. Actually, this is so next. You can click 2 or 3 more times, I think. Yeah. So this is just to show you a couple of the tools. I'm not going to go in detail, but there's, for example, another click, please. Yeah, there's another one. There's, for example, a whole set of rules and tools for vigilance to make sure there's no alerts in the sector. Or that those alerts are well identified and well handled, rather. Next. And actually, as you can see, it's a quite safe sector. There's a very low level of serious adverse reactions in the recipients, the patients treated, both for blood transfusion as well as for different tissue cell applications. Next. So why are we revising these legal frameworks? Because actually we did, while the framework is doing a quite good job, because we identified a couple of shortcomings, in particular to keep the framework future-proof, so that those establishments, meaning the public sector, can continue to develop and offer the therapies to patients. There are 5 key sets of elements. I'm not going to run through all of them. They're about better protecting recipients, but also donors' offspring, making sure the oversight in all the member states is more stringent and equal in all the countries. Also about ensuring sufficient supply. But the more important one for you is the one related to the problem 5, that the framework is lagging behind in innovation. And a key element there is really aiming to make sure there's more legal clarity to advise the sector on when do they have to apply blood tissue cell requirements, and also to do that in good coordination with bodies that do the same task in other legal frameworks. In the pharma framework, for example, the CAT, but there's also other bodies, and also in the medical device framework, there's bodies. So all those measures mentioned here, they also will all strengthen the supply of starting materials for ATMP. Next. And focusing a little bit on the borderline, I think in the prep work for this revision, we did quite some consultation with stakeholders from both sectors, the public sector, the private sector, the pharma as well, the SOHO establishments. And across them, they all flag quite some difficulties with understanding the borderline. A, to understand what are the real criteria that set the borderline, and B, to get a real good advice at EU level and balanced, clear advice on what one framework is applicable. And next, please. And that leads to quite some participants flagging that they really see cases where the classification is very unclear for them, which of course is the last thing you want for developers of innovation. You want them to have clarity so that they really know how to move forward with their innovations. Next, please. And if you look at the borderline criteria, and that's something maybe also to say and important, those borderline criteria are not set in the blood tissue cells framework, but they are set in the pharma framework. There are different elements, like when is there an industrial process, when is there an intention to place on the market, or more scientific elements, substantial manipulation on homologous use, I think come up quite a lot in this setting also. But it's not, so the criteria are set in the pharma framework, not in the BTC framework, and that will not change also with the revision. The BTC framework follows the scope and adapts to the scope of the pharma framework. Next, please.
Fairly briefly, if you can, Stefan, we're running out of time, sorry.
Okay, no problem. So basically the one thing that we will propose is really to get more legal clarity, to have and once more, please, click, and then to have in the BTC framework also an advisory body to make clear when BTC requirements are applicable. And obviously, next please, when those are applicable, it's important to have a very strong coordination with medicinal product and medical device frameworks. So that will be the core proposal to help improve legal clarity for the developers. Next, please. And just to give you an example from the heart of the ATMP sector, if you look at CAR-T preparations, for example, here in the Barcelona clinic in hospital in Spain that is developing those CAR-T for the local patients. If you look at it in this picture, if you see here the preparation being done, this is really actually an authorized tissue establishment with a medical device that is that they're being used, and with additional requirements that have been met to comply with the ATMP framework. So you see everything coming together here. You have blood tissue cells coming out of a donor body that go into a medical device setting and that deliver ATMPs. So I think this makes very clear that it's going to be very important to coordinate also with our legal frameworks on innovation. So I think that was my last part. And can you click once more? I had one or two messages from the pharma strategy, if I can, Jackie. Sorry.
No, please do, but if you could be as brief as possible. So we'll come back to them in our discussions, but we do need to hear the headlines from you, so please do.
Okay,
thank you.
So then just the headlines. Next, please. So the objective of pharma framework is ensuring innovation, make affordable health systems that balance affordability with reward for innovation. Security of supply and access is a key political priority. As you will know, also regulatory burden and environmental footprint. Next. Some ideas put forward there are really to look back into the definitions, future-proof the definition of different concepts, gene therapy, bedside manufacturing, also alignment of GMO, hospital exemption also. So I think it's all elements that come up into your discussion. So basically with this, I mainly want to confirm that those elements are really on the radar of our team who's looking into the pharma framework. So I think with this, I can conclude. The last slide is just a concluding slide. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much indeed for that whistle-stop tour of some very complex issues. And Stefan, if I might, at any point, if people have questions about any of them, I will come back to you. But let us build our picture now. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Anna Hidalgo-Simon, who is Head of Advanced Therapies at the European Medicines Agency. Dr. Hidalgo-Simon, it's very good. I never know whether it's Simon or Simon. Simon, I suspect. Thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, for the good introduction. And wherever you say my name, I get you, and I'm very grateful that you have me here today. So I have a set of slides, and I will just very briefly go through how we are going to look why we are looking at these therapies and have already adapted the way that we regulate them in a substantially different from the way that you have your normal chemicals and your aspirins. Please, next slide. So I'm not going to pass through the disclaimer and the introduction. Let's go to the first content. First, I'm going to say a little bit what are ATMPs and why are so different. Next slide, please. We are not talking here about these chemical elements that you can put a lot of them in one pill. You have a very well-defined medical chemical entity. Next slide. What we have in these therapies is very frequently whole cells, tissues. Another click, please. Tissues, the process and the cells are that element that we are trying to regulate. So you can see from far away that we are dealing with a completely different set of challenges in here. Next slide. So when all this was started to come across 10 years ago, we have a little bit of a division on a classification of what were the elements or the types of advanced therapies. Next slide, please. And we came back with these very distinctive groups. So we have the gene therapies, the somatic cell therapies, the tissue engineered, and the combines. Since then, what is happening is that we have more gray areas than clear products on the columns. We still have some clear products, but it's very clear that science moves and it's very difficult to put things into very clear pools. We need to look at them a little bit more from a higher level. Next slide, please. And the reason for that is that they are really not like other therapies that you will find. And this is just a summary to give you a flavor of why. So the difference between you need an statin and you have one pill every day, or you have a genetic mutation and you have one injection, and that is going to correct the problem. So when we talk about transformative or curative medicines, this is what we mean about. So obviously you cannot take them at home. Not even in every hospital, you will have a specialized hospitals fully trained and prepared for these therapies. They're very difficult to copy, and they are not just large, but enormously more complicated than the traditional medicines. Now, with that comes another problem in safety. That is, if something is going wrong with your statin, you stop taking it, and in a few days it will wash off, and maybe the side effect will stop. If it's a single injection, to reverse that therapy is very, very difficult. They are also very expensive, and they are also, because they are very expensive and very complicated, they are a little bit more difficult to get in the market. They need to fit not only in the NHS systems, in the public health, but also in the way to think about these therapies in the clinical practice and the common practices. So altogether means that having them in the market and having them in the patients is not exactly the same. Next slide, please. So we are having a lot of challenges, but safety is the reason why we need to be so careful with these medicines. So it's very good. They need to work. They need to have good quality. Safety is where the surprises that we don't want may appear. So you know that they may be very rare side effects, but they may come a while after the injection, that single administration. A lot of the time, the administration itself requires surgery or mobilization of the bone marrow. Is not a simple procedure. How to store the cold chain, how long you can keep them. A lot of them are autologous. They can only go back to the same patient that originated the first drugs. They need to be produced under very special conditions, GMP to start with. They need to be careful with the environment. For the people that work with this very complicated material, we are also aware that the virus that we haven't identified yet may be there in the therapies. We are aware of the complications and a lot of things to put, a lot of balls in the air with these therapies. Next slide. And if you have any colleagues within the development of ATMP, you will hear that the challenges are at every level. Next click, please. So you will have a lot of delays. We are seeing this big complication. Please click clicking to have all the tests in there. We are going to see this in the fact that we are actually having quite a few delays. The ATMPs, there were supposed to be many coming. They're coming, but they're coming slowly because it is so difficult to get them to market. Please, next slide until they click all the tests that you can read later on at your own time. Next, next, and next, please. So this is a very high level schema of how to actually deal with these therapies for regulation now. So we have a lot of support for the developers, and the clinical trials are done at national level, and we have a lot of centrally authorized tools to use that I will show you in a minute. We have heard about the hospital exemption. That works very well for some localized or for initial steps, but what we really want is these drugs and these products to be available to every citizen in Europe. And that's why we need to come centrally. We have a system of committees. You have the Committee for Advanced Therapies there and the CHMP, the Human Medicines Products Committee. They work together. And also other committees like the Orphan Drugs and the Pediatric Committee. It's a complex system, but it's a very thorough system. I mentioned Prime, that who was also mentioned by a previous speaker as one of the key tools to help these developers. Then we arrive to a point that we take a decision, and the decision is if for a small or large group of patients, this therapy is going to do more benefit than harm, then it's approved and it should go in the market. Then you will have to deal with the reimbursement and the payers and the system. And we have a loop back. They have very strong pharmacovigilance follow-up requirements, and we are constantly learning and inputting these learnings into the system, so we will be doing it better and better. And also because we need to modify sometimes the marketing authorization status if we find something different. In this slide, we have a list of the tools that are available. And believe me, ATMPs have a lot of opportunities to work with regulators because they are medicines that we need and we want. So we have consultations, parallel advice, parallel with the FDA, scientific advice, classifications, certifications, qualifications of methodology. We have a long list of tools that we want the developers to start engaging with us. And one characteristic of these drugs is that the engagement needs to be very earlier on in the process before we are taking routes that is very difficult to revert later on. Next slide, please. So this is the photo finish of where we are at the moment. So from the beginning of the first authorized drugs in 2009 to now, those are the names of all the medicines that receive a positive marketing authorization. So you can see straight away that out of the original columns, the winners are the gene therapy medicinal products. They are the largest number approved in the market, and also the ones that we are getting more in the system. So probably more will be approved very soon. We're expecting a couple of them more before the end of the year. So we are building up the numbers. We are receiving more. There is a lot of activity in scientific advice and in the earlier stages of development. Then I want to draw your attention to the white boxes. Those are medicines who are not in the market anymore, either because the company did not apply for a renewal of the marketing authorization when the time arrived, or because they were withdrawn from the market. So it's nothing to worry from the safety point of view, because none of those were withdrawn because there was a safety problem or an alert or a signal. They are commercial decisions because they need to be profitable. So the situation at the moment is good, but we need to be very conscientious that we need a regulation to put the drugs in the market, but then we have more work to do to make sure that they stay in the market. The final next slide is my take-home message, which are very simple but very difficult to apply in a way. So they are marvelous, important, essential medicines, but we need to really keep an eye on them. They are very complex to regulate and to develop, and we need to look after them very carefully. The ecosystem is complex. So we are talking here that the traditional statins have medicines, regulators a company took to each other. And with ATMP, it's not enough. We need the patients from very early on. We need all the small players. We need to talk with the HTA bodies, with the reimbursements. We have a lot of input and regulation and conversations to do with the academics, where a lot of these therapies start and continue, and then we need to think about how they fit in the system and what else can we do to follow them up long term, but having them in the patients, in you. And the final idea is that, yes, somebody has mentioned before me, the regulation needs to be flexible because science moves very fast and we don't know what is coming, but we need to be prepared. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for all of that. And we're going to come back on a number of these issues. You were talking there about that iterative process of consultation that you are doing, but you also hope to do more. Before I let you go, there was one question from the audience for you. We heard from Stefan a moment ago about the BTC legislation, about the general pharmaceutical legislation, and there is a lot of focus in the Transform policy asks on that framework and how it all fits together. And I just wonder if you could say 2 words about how the ATMP regulation interacts with those other regulations. And do you think it is still fit for purpose, or does that regulation also need to be looked at again?
It's a complicated question, but thank you for it. This is a good opportunity for the ask and for the community to get involved. And things have changed a lot from the last 15 years. So fit for purpose from the point of view that we are doing well and we have a system that obviously works, certainly. Are there rooms for improvement? Fantastic, they are, and we need to go for them. The idea here is to be in a coordinated situation because we have many pieces in these puzzles, and a lot of the times to just look at one little corner doesn't really bring the solution. So the idea is the coordination between all the changes, but this is the moment. So it is the time to look at it and to see how we can do better.
Anna, you've been wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for taking us through such a complex picture so very, very quickly. Really grateful to you. We are going to look at, I know we can't take these in pieces. It is holistic. They all fit together. But we did want to drill down and focus in on some key areas. And that's what we're going to do in our exchange of views now between some of the Transform MEP members and regulatory experts, really looking at these new approaches to fostering safe and timely access. What are the challenges within this context of this overall revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation? We're going to drill down in 3 areas. I'll tell you about them in a moment, but I'm delighted to welcome Radka Matsova, MEP, who is a member of the Transform MEP Interest Group. Radka, it's great to have you with us, and also back, I hope, Andrzej Knotek. And Andrzej, I just wanted to ask each of you before we launch our exchanges of views. Radka, for you, we've been hearing a lot from our opening speakers about the importance that the framework is robust, that it is future-proof and flexible, that it really does stimulate innovation. And in some areas where we're doing very well, in some areas, Alexander Nats told us at the beginning, a lot of approvals coming through, but we're beginning to lag on clinical trials, and he's a little bit concerned. How do we make sure, what for you are the most important issues if we are to make sure that Europe remains an attractive place to develop ATMPs, and so the environment really works for these therapies? What do you think we should be focusing on, Radka? Same question to you, and then to Andrzej Knotek, and then we'll move to our topics. Radka.
Dear colleagues, thank you for the floor, Jackie, and dear esteemed experts. I'm sorry very shortly because I have some family accident and I can't be with you all event. And thank you for having me here. It's very important for me because this topic is very close to my heart. And I like cooperate with you, and also thank you for dedicating your time to this very important topic, also for people in Czech Republic. As you know, we know that ATMPs are complex medicines and must undergo evidence generation pathway that different from additional medicines. This has an impact on the availability of data, which means that we need to look at how to adapt regulatory processes to accommodate these innovative therapies. And because I am not expert, I am a politician and I can do better condition for life with people with these problems. I have a question, if it is possible. How can, this question for your experts, how can and should regulatory processes be adapted to accommodate the specific characteristic of these innovative therapies while ensuring efficient and rapid regulatory review? What does the Alliance recommend it? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Radka. And as you say, this adapting, we've heard some of the things that are being done on the hoof, as it were, and we've also heard about some of the aims of this legislation. So let me bring in our panel who are going to try and answer that and a few questions also from me. Delighted to welcome Dr. Paula Sanvikangas, who is Director of Biopharmaceuticals and ATMP at NDA Group and former chair of the European Medicines Agency Committee for Advanced Therapies. A warm welcome to you, Paula. To Dimitrios Anathasiou, board member of the World Duchenne Organization and a member of EMA's Pediatric Committee, and Marcello Milano, Director of R&D and Regulatory Policy EU at BioMarin. Very warm welcome to you all. So that key question, and indicate to me who would like to take up the challenge first. In terms of the recommendations that you've developed, and there will be a link in the chat to those policy asks so you can all read them later, what would you highlight in terms of what adaptations are needed to deal with the fact that these are, as we've heard from Radka, from Anna, complex medicines, and we need they're very different from traditional medicines in terms of the way we generate evidence and so on. What are the key recommendations? Marcello, what would you highlight as a really important recommendation out of the number of them that there are?
Thank you, Jackie, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. We'd probably like these processes to be even more functional, more flexible, and faster. Those are the key words for all ATMP developers, probably. I'd like to touch on a few areas where adaptations would be needed to achieve this based on the recommendations that have been produced by Transform. The first one is more iterative engagement between developers, the EMA, and its committees. Industry needs opportunities for more informal discussions with regulators from the very early stages of development, but also the provision of formal scientific advice should be optimized to increase efficiencies in the system and maximize the benefits and the clarity of responses. Another area is ideally the EMA should become a regulatory sort of one-stop shop for innovative therapies, facilitated interactions with all involved agencies. There is a concern among developers of complex therapies that are often used in combination with a device or a diagnostic, that regulatory systems for those different components still operate in silos in Europe, and they're not really joined up. Another area is really creating more opportunities for earlier joint interactions between the developers, the agency, patients, and the so-called downstream stakeholders, HTA bodies and payers, to really align to the extent that is possible, obviously, on the evidence generation pre and post approval. This is very critical for ATMPs in particular that tend to be approved based on a smaller data package. Another area is the MA Prime scheme. We have an important opportunity to make the scheme even better, building on the first 5 years of experience, for example, allowing ATMP developers to enter the scheme early.
Let's come back to the detail of how we can do it. At the moment, I'm just trying to identify the challenges that we face. Those for you, was there any other one that you would highlight as something we need to talk about?
Yeah, maybe very briefly, the last area I wanted to mention is really introducing an overall streamlining and acceleration of centralized procedure, including the European Commission decision-making process, which could shorten the EU approval time for novel therapies and increase Europe competitiveness. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Lots to come back on. As I say, I want to sort of then break it down into bite-sized chunks, and also so that Radka can hear from each of you your headline answers before she has to leave us. Dimitrios, great to have you with us as well. In terms of those recommendations, would you highlight the same ones Marcello has, or are there other things you would particularly point to?
Thank you very much. I think Marcelo covered everything. First of all, I would like to thank our MEPs and especially our Czech colleagues. Let's say that they have a very serious job to do in the next months. Radka, all the best for the easier resolve of the personal issue. So if I'm talking to politicians, I'm going to take it, as not my regulatory hat, but as my patient hat. So I can echo Anna and Stefan, what they said about affordability and accessibility. So we have to consider that all these tools, they are there for a reason. The reason is to develop them and to have access to them. So not to have a lottery, for example, postcode lottery, as we say. And if you live in the right side of the border, you have access and you live. And if you live in the wrong side of the border, you don't have access and you die. The point is what you need for this. And what we need for this, obviously, the acceleration of these technologies is enormous. But also the failure of commercial use is also enormous. If you see Anna's graph, we saw a very big proportion that failed commercially. So we have to keep in mind that these are, because they're new, still, we don't have economy of scales, and we have to consider how we can fix that. The production limitations. We have to consider how we can make them cheaper, affordable, and monitor them for a long time. Also, we need flexibility in regulatory work, which EMA have to give this, it's really making very hard work to do so, but we need this through the pipeline. So we need end-to-end process. So we need a streamline, because whatever collection of data we should do in the regulatory work, it should answer the reimbursement questions also. Otherwise, we lose time. So the one is time. I'm coming from rare disease. I can tell you that 35% of our children die by 5. So I really love the safety, but I love more the efficacy, if you allow me. So my maybe last comment is, yes, we have to keep attractiveness. Clinical trials is important for Europe. Being attractive is important because it affects access. It affects also, if I can quote it, cheaper access, let's call it like that, and faster access. So that is important. The second is the tools that we use. So tools that designed 20, 25 years ago, I'm not sure they fit for purpose now. And in order for everybody to do his job, we have to have resources. So we have to make sure that our policymakers and all of us as a community, if we want our children to survive, our rare disease patients, our patients to survive overall, we have to have a priority. And in order to have priority, we have to put our money where our mouth is. Thanks.
Absolutely. And something I hope we'll come back on a little bit later on. So highlighting there really that importance, yes, it has to be a robust framework, as Simone said, with patient safety at its heart, as has already been underlined, and quality and efficacy standards, but also, as you said, absolutely vital that Europe remains attractive as a place to develop them for the reasons you've given. So what is that, Paula, from your perspective, in order to make sure that Europe does remain attractive and that we do take maximum advantage out of this? And as Demetrios said, let's remember what all these tools are for. What for you would you highlight among the recommendations as most important?
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you today. I'm perhaps coming from a little bit different angle, having reviewed these products as a regulator for 14 years and working over 20 years overall within this space. I think our legislation as such is quite good. I think it has been working well because we do have a lot of approved products, and we have great advancement in that sector. But still, I think that the legislation, when we're talking about revisions, they should be proportionate. The changes should be proportionate to risks. And I would highlight what was said already, that we see huge advancement in development of ATMPs. The scientific progress is tremendous. And I would also say that we are living kind of a hype of very modern ATMPs. But at the same time, those are bringing significant modifications to the cells and genome of the patients. And we don't have the knowledge what the impact of these changes will be in long run for these patients. And if we think about these products, for example, cells, they are living organelles. They have own signaling systems. They have tens of thousands of genes expressed in proteins. And yet, if you look what is controlled of these cells when they are given to the patients, it's 15 to 20 critical quality attributes. So it means that we don't have even a promille of understanding of the cells when those are given to the patients. The same is with viruses and with the gene therapies. We used to think that AAVs are safe, they don't integrate, and today we know that they integrate everywhere. They are spanning the whole genome, random integrations, and we don't know what it means clinically. Only with wider use, longer follow-up of the patients, we will start understanding. And in my view, we still have huge gaps in our knowledge. And when we are adapting the legislation, we have to know what towards we are moving for. We are moving to more complex products, perhaps more risky products. Is it time for flexibility in our legislation? I don't think so. I think it should be proportionate really to the risks and complexity of the products. And one thing that is, if we think about attractiveness of Europe, is stable legal regulatory framework that the companies and developers can rely on. If we have major changes every 15 years, no industry can tolerate that.
Okay.
And I have to say that there are over 1,300 developers, ATMP developers globally, and around over 600 are in US, around 400 in Asia Pacific, and only 330 in the EU. So we have to think the changes in legislation, not only from the EU point of view, but also from more global point of view, and also thinking that globally the regulators are trying to harmonize the requirements to make it easier for the industry and all developers.
Indeed. And Paula, if I could follow up on that, one of those areas where that attempt to harmonize, to make it easier and so on, is the new clinical trial regulation, because it is said that this fragmentation of the rules and so on across Europe is one of the reasons. So you said the legislation is quite good, we're doing well, we do have a lot of approved products. Alexander said the same, but he did express a concern about clinical trials and that we are beginning to lag behind in that area. Do you think the new regulation, just to follow up with you, Paula, on that point, does it go far enough to address those issues and really make Europe attractive, given what was said earlier by Dimitris about why this matters so much, why attractiveness matters so much?
Yes, conducting clinical trials in the EU has been a challenge for industry, especially because of the multiple member states having different questions, different views. And by the new clinical trial legislation, there will be, at least for the pivotal trials, which usually are the multi-site trials, to have more kind of centralized views and common understanding of the clinical trials. But that doesn't change the situation of, for example, clinical trials for very rare diseases where there are very few patients usually available for the trials. Those will still be conducted in one site, most probably. They will not be large phase 3 trials. They will be small phase 2 trials for the pivotal ones. And my concern is that if these developers do not get proper support early in the development, they will be facing the problems when approaching the marketing authorization phase. And in my opinion, we should be trying to get more centralized support for the companies, the same way as we have for Prime, but for a wider group of developers, especially those that are bringing first-in-class products into the market.
Bear with me. Dimitrios, on this issue of clinical trials, does the new regulation go far enough? Fairly quickly, if you would, because I want to touch on all of these issues. I want to come back on Prime. I want to come back on the one-stop shop idea that Marcello was talking about. So we're going to have to take these in sort of quick bite-sized chunks, as it were. But Dimitrios, on the clinical trial regulation, does it go far enough?
Thank you. I think it's a good start, but nothing goes far enough, especially when it comes to clinical trials for children and when you're talking about high unmet needs. So neonatals pediatric cancers, rare diseases. So even in the participation of the patients, we could do better. Obviously, we could do better inside the description of the regulation. And I think all of our organizations have commented. The second thing that it is connected, is the ethical process that we have from time to time in various national levels. And the third most critical is the implementation, because we have seen the cross-border implementation. I think we've learned from that very well, what it means at the end. Hopefully, this will be resolved and we can continue to build on this. But I need one more second on this. Paula passed a very nice pass, let's say, about safety and if it is flexible enough. I think, as I said, it should be flexible enough, because I can give you two conditions. The one is diabetes, and you're talking about the gene therapy that will affect you for the rest, I don't know, 40 years. The other one is the pre-treatment SMA type 1 that lives 16 months. I think the risk benefit for the side effects of a gene therapy in the long run is completely different if you ask any parent or if it was your child. Thank you very much. I'm passing the stick to you.
Which brings us back to the point about proportionality that has been underlined very much by Paula earlier. Marcello, on the clinical trial regulation, is it now fit for purpose?
Thank you, Jackie. I think, it's a positive step, especially for multinational trials, as I think Paula was alluding to. However, and I think Dimitrio has a point there, implementation is crucial to really deliver on the promises. The actual transition time is short. From January next year, all new trials will have to be submitted under the regulation. And one of the first main efforts for me, for the Commission and EMA, should be to monitor and ensure all member states are ready to follow the regulation and are able to use the portal and are able to meet the deadlines. And speaking of national competent authorities, there's going to be a huge wave of new trials under the CTR from next year. And we think they need support to ensure they have sufficient expertise, resources, and new level training for assessing this increasing number of clinical trials with complex ATMPs in particular. The portal itself has been launched as a sort of minimum viable product, which will highlight, and we know is already highlighting, technical limitations. And we need workarounds for those, and addressing those shortcomings should be prioritized. The other key point, I think, for industry and Transform is the EMA and the Commission should be vigilant to prevent national agencies from setting additional procedural and documentation requirements which are not foreseen in the regulation. We really need to make sure that all relevant documentation can be submitted via the portal and reduce the documentation requirements rather than increasing them. And so I'm becoming a bit technical, and maybe I'll pause there so there's enough time for other points.
Thank you. On that issue of resource, there is a question from Justine Kuber in our audience saying the idea, and you touched on this, Marcello, earlier, of making the European Medicines Agency a one-stop shop for ATMP developers comes up in the policy asks. It's very clear. It's also in the Parliament's own initiative report on the pharmaceutical strategy. How could the agency be best supported to deliver, to really become that one-stop shop? Is it just straightforwardly a question of resource? And Demetrios, let me come to you first this time on that one, because you're part of the EMA's Pediatric Committee. What does it need? How can it be supported to play that role? Same question to you, Paula, because you've also been directly involved through the Committee on Advanced Therapies. Demetrios first.
Thank you very much. I think that most of these technologies are global development. So we have to keep this in mind. So interaction with other regions, it is a top priority. Do we have enough EMA, FDA coordination? I think harmonization can be better. There is a lot of effort. Do we have enough resources? I don't think we do. And that's my personal opinion. Don't quote me, let's say, or the pediatric committee on that. So we need more resources. We need more knowledge, because these are really complex models. When we're having the discussion about how we can use the data, most of these technologies are for rare diseases. So we might be talking for 5 patients in the world. I mean, I really would like to see a double-blind randomized clinical trial on this, and how our framework can continuously collect data throughout the process after even the reimbursement. So what we need, at least my personal opinion, is that yes, we need resources, but we also need a very clear pathway that will enrich the process, because this will make Europe more attractive. We have to engage early. We have to engage with all the stakeholders. We have to know what down the stream the stakeholders need to reach decisions, and we have to ask this information very early, together with the patients also, because they have to be meaningful. We don't do research for research, you know, we do for cures.
Thank you very much. Paula, for you, how important do you think it is for the EMA to play this role, and what does it need to do it?
Yes, I think the coordination role for EMA is self-evident for ATMPs. It should be that way. But I would bring up here the collaboration between the European different stakeholders, and starting from the European Commission. I think it is highly important that the different sections in the European Commission work together properly, so that we can solve issues like the GMO applications for clinical trials, that we can sort up quickly these kind of issues that are preventing companies and developers going into the clinical trials and bringing forward these medicines. Otherwise, they are stuck with these ridiculous requirements that are not proportionate for example, a GMO was established for crop and not for gene therapy products, but it has taken years and years of discussion, and still we don't have any outcome. And I think we need these kind of crosstalks between the stakeholders inside the European Union, but also between EMA, between medical device sector, between the BTC sector, to look where the pitfalls are and how those could be helped. But for example, for the combined ATMPs, we already have in the legislation the pathway, how the assessment goes, and we know how to engage the notified bodies and all the medical device sector in the evaluation of the combination. So we have the footsteps, but they have to be put into right place.
And I want to come back in a moment to that engagement, and particularly the focus on the patients, but you also talked about engagement with researchers, with academics and so on. But Marcello, a quick thought, if you would, on this question of the EMA as a one-stop shop and what it needs.
Yeah, and I think, you know, much has been said already by Dimitrios and Paula, and I think we often, you know, hesitate to talk about resources, but to me, it's obviously, you know, a very important point, and we should look at this at different levels, at the centralized level for the agency itself, but obviously the agency draws from the national agency, so there is an issue of resources and of expert resources at the level of national agencies. So I'd just like to, you know, reiterate that point, that is really, you know, underline and a key enabler for all these improvements and optimizations that we hope to see, in particular for ATMP therapies.
Thank you very much. I wanted to come back on this engagement and two aspects of it, really. And I'll start in the logical place for this one, because I'm asking him to put his patient hat back on, as you put it earlier, Dimitrios. In terms of, Simone Boselli spoke to us at the beginning, and he underlined, as have you, the vital importance of that patient involvement. And indeed, the policy asks underline that patients should be at the center of decision-making, and the EMA has recognized the need to do this in a more systematic way, in a more quantitative way. What for you is the key? What needs to change if we're to make sure that we're going to get this right? Dimitrios, first on this one.
Thank you very much. Although I'm not a creature very easily pleased, I have to say that they do a great job. And this is very, very, very rare for me to come, let's say, from my mouth. So I have to say that in EMA, they really try their best to incorporate the patient voice. I mean, we have seen their role in the committees. Although we torture them, I think we improve the quality of the work. We've seen this in the scientific advice. We've seen the decision-making, this HMP. So it is continuously, let's say, increased meaningfully, I say. One item that maybe we can do better, and I'm not maybe closing it only to the EMA. I mean, the framework is open. So we have how many regulations open? What we don't understand fully, I mean, beyond the HTA part, the patient involvement, etc., I don't even want to go there, is how the voice of the patient community and the actual users of the services, because all this happens for one reason, because we exist, and we are having this discussion because of that, is how this is incorporated and how these regulations are working between each other. So I really would like to know how the real-world evidence, for example, from Darwin, is working with the clinical trial regulation and at the same with the health data and the ERNs. You know, we never get this total frame of how they are interconnected. And I know, Stefan, sorry for that. I think that you really do try to do an amazing job, but there are a big chunks of work that we have to connect them. And in this connection, I think the glue is the patient.
Thank you very much indeed. And a comment to that, Marcello, and also just to pick up on a point Anna made earlier, also she made a point about academics. And so do the policy house underline that a lot of these ATMPs are developed outside of industry. They're developed in research centers and so on. And so that dialogue has to be, yes, with industry, with people like you, but it also has to be really early and really iterative with those groups. Quick comments to those from you and then from Paula, please. And then I want to come back to Prime before we finish, if we can squeeze it in. But Marcello, on this point.
Yeah, you know, I'm not I think probably the right expert to talk about academia. You know, I come obviously from a very different environment, but yes, I think you know the point around early engagement is very important. It has to be iterative. It has to be agile, it has to be sustainable. We mentioned resources previously, and everything needs to be sustainable, which is obviously a challenge. Early engagement with patients, which Dimitrios pointed to, clearly obviously important. That
can it be improved?
I think it can, and especially Jackie, I feel it needs to be more coordinated, because in the end I think regulators will be approaching patients, companies will be approaching patients, but patients are only so many, and their time and resources are constrained. So that effort needs really to be coordinated. And also I assume, and Dimitrios can speak better to that they need, you know, some training, U-level support for education, for example, because we're talking about complex therapies and scientific issues that are complex for these products, and therefore training is very important. So finally, I think maybe if I can make a last point on that, is transparency about how the patient input and experience and patient preferences were factored in the benefit risk assessments or in providing advice on drug developments. I think patient data should be included in label. I suppose if you're contributing your own data and experience, you'd like to see very clearly how that made a difference in the end.
Thank you. Paula, those two sides of the coin, the greater involvement of the patient, and do you think we're broadly getting it right, or do you want to see changes? And a comment also to that research question.
Yes, thank you. I would like to highlight that the Committee for Advanced Therapies already has had from the beginning 2 permanent patient representatives and their alternates. So there is already the patient voice, and CHMP in the same manner can utilize and have patient representatives heard as part of their decision making. So we have the tools already. But I agree with Dimitrios about the fact that maybe the voice of the actual patient group that is involved is not heard in a proper manner. I mean, they could be better placed into the context. And I think what I'm always listening to this discussion that ATMPs are so highly expensive. But if you think about, for example, an SMA patient who lives beyond the 2 years, I mean, the costs must be skyrocketing for keeping such a patient in and out hospital, immobilized into wheelchair with respiratory help. Nobody is comparing the costs of this one single treatment versus the lifelong treatment of these highly debilitated patients. Then going to the academic sector, it is true that half of the clinical trials are conducted by academics and government sector. But the difference is that majority of those are in early trials, phase 1-2, whereas industry is conducting most of the phase 3 trials.
Mm.
And here I see a clear difference. I think that the academics are bringing a lot of novel ideas, novel portfolios, novel products to the clinical trials, but it takes a lot of resources and efforts to bring these products up to the market. And they're often partnering with industry is a good way forward. That brings also knowledge on the regulatory requirements and increases the success rate at the MEA level.
Thank you very much. And we do have to move on in a moment, but I cut you off, Marcello, in your prime in answer to the first question. And I mentioned the word prime deliberately because you wanted to say 2 words about early access tools like Prime in 2 words. What do you want to see happen? Do you think they are working as effectively as they could? Really in half a minute, if you would. Sorry.
It's worked well. I think the 5-year analysis shows areas of improvements. One I've mentioned is early access to all sorts of ATMP developers. So that's one area. The other area is knowledge building within the Prime scheme, so that when we get to the review of the marketing authorization application, we can have the smoothest possible review process. And perhaps the last point that I may be talking about early access more broadly that I'd like to mention is I think another reflection is needed on conditional marketing authorization, which is likely to occur for ATMPs in rare conditions, given the limited data sets, the uncertainties around the long-term effects and at the time of approval, and thinking about the new modalities, such as gene editing. I think this tool is going to be used on a relatively frequent basis, but at the moment, and I think against the intent of the regulation, conditional marketing authorization seems to constitute a barrier almost to market access. So we need to work on that and change the perception, with the downstream stakeholders.
Thank you. I see lots of emphatic nodding, so I'm going to hope that means you are in agreement, because we do need to move on. But thank you so much. I'm very grateful to you for that. So we are now going to move on to talk about ensuring appropriate use of the hospital exemption. And for this, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Stefano Ferrari, Head of R&D at the Veneto Eye Bank Foundation, on behalf of the European Alliance for Vision Research and Ophthalmology, EUI, Dr. Martin Telko, Global Public Affairs Director for Biomedical Innovation at Novartis, and Stefan, I hope he manfully said earlier he would join us, come back and join this discussion. If you are there, Stefan, it would be great. Stefan van der Spiegel, thank you so much. So let us jump straight into this one. And let's talk first about what are we talking about. And Stefano, what role does this exemption play under the ATMP regulation within the ecosystem? Just explain for us a little bit why it's so important, if you would.
The hospital exemption is one of the articles, is part of the Article 28 of the European regulation on the use of ATMPs. And I think it is very important, it has been very important for the development of new ATMPs that at the moment do not have whenever there isn't a centrally approved product, the hospital exemption can help to deliver a new product. So to build up, all the knowledge, then to come to a proper amount of knowledge that then can get to the marketing authorization. I think that, and this is the point why I'm here and why I am raising this point. I think that the hospital exemption is not particularly good, is not particularly implemented when a centrally approved medicinal product is present on the market. And I'm saying this one because, like, for example, I come from, I'm not making any name or talking about any product. I'm coming from the ophthalmology world. So I'm coming from an eye bank, and we have developed treatments for limbal stem cell preparation for limbal stem cell deficiency efficiency. So we've been crucial to produce all the products, all the evidence, all the quality and safety documents to make sure that some products, the products for the liver stem cell deficiency, could get to the marketing authorization. And then now that we have a marketing authorization for this product, everybody who was working in a sort of hospital exemption producing this product now had to stop. And I think this is it's not very difficult only to accept, but I think that it can make a problem also for the patients and availability of these pharmaceutical products for the patient. And then I'll come back to that later.
Thank you very much indeed. Martin, from your perspective, what role is it playing, and is it working as well as it could to meet individual patients' needs in a timely way, in a cost-effective way, while addressing that safety issue that has been underlined throughout, of course?
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, for having me and allowing me to speak on this very important topic that is also a key priority for the Transform Alliance. So as an employee of a pharmaceutical industry, let me preface my answer by saying industry is not categorically against hospital exemption. We just want to see it used appropriately. So we do believe that hospital exemption has an important role in the ATMP ecosystem. In serious cases, when there's no approved treatment available to patients and no clinical trials that they can participate in, patients should have access to experimental treatments under hospital exemption. Now, if you ask me if this is working well for patients, the answer is we don't really know. It's a very fragmented system throughout Europe, and the data on the use of the hospital exemption is not really being collected. So it's hard to say how many patients are receiving treatment under hospital exemption, how they fare immediately after treatment, how they fare in the long term. That lack of transparency is not in the interest of patients and can be improved upon. So, you know, I really want to stress again, in our view, hospital exemption is or a lot of treatments offered for hospital exemption have not undergone clinical trials. They have not been reviewed or approved by regulators and are not subject to a GMP or quality control the same way that marketed products are. And that's why we believe whenever possible and whenever available, patients should benefit from the authorized treatment with demonstrated safety and efficacy.
Stefano, I don't know whether you want, I think we've lost Stefan for the moment. I don't see him on the list at the moment, and his camera's not appearing. So hopefully we'll get him back. But just on that, he flashed up, there he is. He's back. Stefan, I don't know, before we come to that question about lack of transparency and so on, and I want to ask about European registries and what role they might be able to play. But Stefan, a broad comment, if you would, in terms of the role of this exemption, and do you think it's working as it should?
It's a difficult question to answer. I think it's fair to say that it's not fully fully assessed yet. But there are, I think, a couple of indications that it could be very useful. I think, but it's all about finding a balance where every sector has its place, the private actors as well as the public actors. I think the case that Professor Ferrari has introduced is important. You can have situations, I think, in both sides where it's better to have central therapy to have large availability, and inverse where it's better to have hospital-based therapies to have large access. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Two things I would like to underline from the discussion I heard is our end objective is really, are we able to offer good and safe therapies to EU patients? I think that is the one core underlying objective. And that includes access, that also includes cost elements, because in the end, if you don't get that sorted out, you will not have the patients available. And the second element I wanted to plea for a bit, coming of course from where I come, is really, there is an important role here, I think, for public sector actors. As said, many academics are at the base of it. I think the EU healthcare system in general are very strong. And we see also in other therapy areas like in vitro fertilization, where we work with reproductive cells, that EU actors are really leading globally, and attracts also patients from from abroad, and maybe we had new therapies there 40 years ago, where we are now with the therapies maybe in this area, but now is really very broadly applied therapies across Europe, and we have close to 1 million cycles a year. And also what one, and then to come back to the beginning, I think it's true that there's maybe not full evidence on hospital exemption, but there are some indications. I think one case that came to our attention recently is a case in Spain, in Barcelona, where CAR-T therapies were developed in a hospital exemption setting at a strongly reduced cost. I think it was like 1/5 of the cost, which of course has an impact on patient access in the end. So I think it is important to look further into it. I don't have the answers here, but I think it's something to look into.
And indeed, Iona Salti in our audience referenced that, saying what lessons can be learned from Spain, which have authorized the first publicly owned ATMP, and where the ATMP developer received a designation as a reference hospital and is fully assessed at national level, and how will this play in cross-border care, referring, she says, to the gene therapy in acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Stefano, a reaction to what you've heard, and I would like to particularly pick up on that point about transparency and ask you, one of the things that is what the Alliance is recommending is the creation of European registries as a way to address that transparency issue. How would it work, and what would the benefits for patients be?
I think we are really stressing the point of having a European registry. I mean, we are doing this one, for example, for corneal transplantation, where there are many registries, like, for example, in the UK, in Holland, in Sweden, and we also created a European registry for corneal transplantation. We think that, I mean, if we want to implement hospital exemption in the same way as the Spanish has done with their own product, maybe the idea could be to have, well, first of all, there should be some pillars. So the laboratory that produced the ATMP, the hospital exemption should be working in GMP, so with the same safety and quality system of a marketing authorized ATMP. It should be authorized by the competent authorities, and it should work in the GMP setting. And then everything should be put into a registry where we have basically indication of which is the establishment which has produced the ATMP, which is the product, the quality assessment that has been gone through, the authorization that has been passed, and the surgery that has been provided, the patient that has been transplanted, the follow-up system, everything. In the corneal system, so with tissues, we are already doing this one, and it works. And I think if the same could be applied also for ATMP produced in a hospital exemption, this would basically sort of decrease all the anxiety of people regarding the fact that they are less controlled than the marketing authorized ones.
And indeed, another question relating to Spain, saying in the case of the CAR-T developed under the hospital exemption in Spain, which Stefan mentioned, why is the clinical trial legislation not used instead? Do you think hospital exemption is being used in a way that circumvents clinical trials legislation? And just to link to the picture, because we're going to have to address this in one quick round, a question from Paula from our last panel to you, Stefan. How is the cost reduced in the hospital exemption production if the requirements are set the same as for licensed products? If the requirements are allowed to be lower under hospital exemption, is it increasing the risks for patients? Should we really move towards a two-standard system in the EU, says Paula? I'll give you a chance to come back on that, Stefan. But Martin, a word on registries, and do you think they will address your transparency concerns? And to this broader question we're having here, and a lot of it is about different member states doing this in different ways. Martin first, and then to Stefan.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. It's a very fragmented system in Europe. There are countries that are doing it different, or all countries are doing it in their own way. Some do it at a very high standard. Others, we believe, are at a lower standard. So to answer the question about the registries, yes, I mean, I agree with much of what Stefano has said. I think a registry would be helpful and would be in the interest of patients. That transparency would certainly be helpful for patients and also for the regulators. There are clearly legitimate use cases for hospital exemption, but I think the regulators must monitor the use to ensure that it is not being used to bypass seeking a marketing authorization, which is something that you know, I guess somebody from the audience has raised.
Absolutely, absolutely. So very much echoing those concerns. Yeah,
exactly. And if really if a treatment shows promise in use, you know, so many more patients can benefit if that product undergoes a clinical trial and is subject to a rigorous regulatory review and centralized approval process.
Yeah.
So registry would go a long way in creating that transparency also for regulators.
Thank you very much. Stefan, a reaction from you, and particularly those questions from the audience, and a quick word from Stefan, and then we'll have to move on again. Sorry, I just said it was a quick fire round. Stefan.
Okay, thanks a lot. I don't have the answers to all of that. All I mentioned is that I think it should be explored, the hospital exemption. And I think with that, we need to keep our end objective in mind, make sure that EU citizens have access to safe and effective therapies. I think, I don't know the details, but I think there are effectively clinical trials, and there's quite some rigid processes in place in Spain, and in that case that was mentioned. But I would suggest maybe you should, for a next meeting, invite the people who are doing it, so that might be useful. On Paula's question, I think it is important to distinguish between cost and price. The price is can be set in function of the cost, or the price can be set in function of the value of a therapy, which often is much higher. And I think from past cases, we've seen that the public sector really is much more offering therapies at cost price, while maybe the private sector is more aiming for value-based pricing. But that's a discussion maybe also one's worth to explore. And then on the need for evidence, absolutely, I think that is key. And I just wanted to flag, as Dr. Ferrari already mentioned, that there are a lot of registries in the transplant sector. I think that is a sector that historically has developed strong registries, not only in corneas, also the bone marrow transplant registry, etc. So,
thank you very much, Stefano. A quick reaction, if you would. I know it's a complex issue, but.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, there should be an harmonization, because, like, for example, when we talk about routine basis, I mean, we should define very well, the guidelines from the European Union should define very well what, for example, non-routine basis application means. Is it 10 patients like in the Netherlands, or it is whatever like in the Germany? This is important. The other one is that the costs normally are lower and the prices is lower because we, as non-profit organization or academia or hospitals, we don't have to make profit, so costs can be lower. The other thing is that we should also, in the case of the presence of a marketing authorized ATMP, I think that we should have at the same time also hospital exemption ATMP being produced for two reasons. First one is, as Anna was saying earlier on, one thing is having the product, one thing is getting to the patients. Once the company goes and negotiate with the competent authority the price, then, and we know, I mean, how expensive these are. Normally the regulators say, well, we can treat only 5 or 10 patients, no more than that, because the budget is that one. And so, I mean, so what about all the other patients? So having an ATMP produced by hospital exemption would allow also other patients to be treated. And if the company withdraw the marketing authorization, at least we have somebody producing a product that then can be used for these patients.
Thank you very much indeed. And I am sorry, I'd love to have continued the discussion longer, but we do have to move on. Stefan, please stay with me for our last quick fire panel. Martin, Stefano, thank you very much indeed. We are going to move to our third topic now, classification of ATMPs and BTC. We heard earlier about the blood, tissue and cell legislation proposals for the safety, administration and monitoring of transformative therapies. Delighted to welcome back MEP Andrei Nodek, who, as I mentioned earlier, is co-chair of the MEP interest group. We also have with us Dr. Vincenzo De Angelis, director of the Italian National Blood Center and coordinator of the GAPP-JA. We have Professor Giulio Cossu, professor of regenerative medicine at the University of Manchester, who's with us on behalf of the Federation of the European Academies of Medicine, FEAM. Dr. Andrula Eleftheriou, executive director of the Thalassemia International Federation, and back again with us, Stefan van der Spiegel. Andre Notek, if you are still, you aren't appearing on my screen, but I hope, there you are. Yes, thank you. Do you have a question for our experts to kickstart this discussion?
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, I do. This topic of classification of ATMPs and BTCs is very interesting topic, and those two possibilities and those two applications, they are managed through two different regulatory regimes. However, in the production process, not in all cases, but in some of them, they are linked, because the BTCs could be used to produce NTMPs, and this brings a kind of a legal uncertainty. And the Transform group dedicated some time to it and proposed kind of a solution that at the level of EMA, there will be kind of advocacy for the companies to come in the beginning and ask for the path, which one is to be selected. However, I would be happy to hear from our experts if they could elaborate on this issue itself, because, as I said, it's a very interesting topic, and also on the proposed solution, whether this could lead to a solution. So this is my question. Thank you very much.
Vincenzo De Angelis, would you like to come in first?
Thank you.
Big question.
Big question. Well, I just can answer from the point of view of the gap action. The gap action, in my opinion, could be considered sort of answer to your question, because this action involved 25 beneficiaries and 15 collaborating partners with outcomes that are both for the competent authority in the context of authorization of innovative therapies and the European Commission in the view of revision of the European legislation with the aim to make more flexible toward innovation, as a lot of persons asked today during the presentation that had been done previously with the audience.
Thank you very much indeed. Andrew Letherio, you're muted at the moment, sorry.
Yes, thank you for giving us this opportunity. Well, indeed, I'm not speaking as a technical expert or as an expert of the regulations. However, I'm speaking on behalf of the patients and patients with transfusion-dependent thalassemia, for whom BCT is a very important regulation. And we have also experienced recently the disappointment of the withdrawal of an advanced transformative therapy from the European Union with the pharmaceutical product with the ATMP of Zindeglo. And therefore, we would like to see, first and above all, that the development of the ATMPs does bring transformation in the clinical practice, but also in the patient outcomes, but at the same time brings access to the patients and affordability to the healthcare system so that they can give access to the patients. Now, the Zindeglo was an example of a product that was developed from BTC and processed following a very long processing of BTC and then infused into the patient. It also had centralized kind of procedure for the product preparation. And the concern of the patients were the coverage of the standards and safety of all the process from the beginning to the whole processing of the blood and the reinfusion to the patient. And we have seen that there are gray areas. There are areas that we are not aware of how standards were being kept, whether the standards were consistent at all times. And therefore, we very much support the inclusion in the BTC legislation currently of the preparation process authorization, but also very much support that these processes authorized at the European level with a kind of mechanism that will be more or less mandatory so that all European countries can have the same interpretation on the classification and on the
want to come back on that. Want to come back on that in a moment and how it should work, how it might work. Giulio Cossu, in terms of the importance of this issue and what you expect from the revision. We heard from Stefan earlier, the outlines of what they're trying to do. Why does this matter so much from your perspective?
Well, so let me start by saying that I feel a little an alien here because I'm still active in running clinical trials as an academic. And I recently, for reason would be too long to tell you, moved the trial from Manchester to Milan, which meant I learned on my body how fun is to deal with two completely different regulations. And I had the fun of starting all over again once I thought I was done through. So it's extremely, this has been said many times, but I think that an harmonization among all the regulatory agencies in Europe is necessary. And then there is another point I would like to make. I see one hand standing. Vincenzo wants to say something. Oh, can you wait for, it will take another 2 minutes. The second and last point I want to make that was touched briefly by Anna in her talk, but I think is becoming a more and more serious problem is the fact that more and more successful therapy, life-saving, are withdrawn from the market, either because a price is not negotiated, as it happened, or because the company who is handling the product, for whatever reason, decide that they will not produce it anymore, like it happened for Strimvelis, first with GSK, and then with the Orchard. Sorry, this is a little bit of Alzheimer. So the problem is we really need to look at that from an European point of view, because it's an immense waste of money, resource, and also ethically, it's not acceptable that we say to a patient, there is an available therapy. And I was at San Raffaele when I saw the first kids with ADA's kid, and now they're grown up and they live a normal life. And we cannot prevent, there must be a way through. The government, EMA, someone has to work together to find a way so that if the company decide, and the companies follow their logic profit. So is there, you know, we cannot say you're bad boys. It's just that we need a way supported by national governments to produce the product and administer to patients in centers that should be dedicated to that. That's what I want to say.
Thank you very much. Vincenzo, a quick one if you would. Yeah, you're muted at the moment, Vincenzo.
Just my quick comment. I fully agree with Giulio about the different regulations. Talking as a competent authority, with regard to the result of the impact assessment performed by European Commission within the revision of the directives, I fully agree with Stefan van der Spiegel. A new advisory board in charge of supporting the competent authorities in the evaluation of the new blood and tissue and cell products is really important and welcome. And this board should ensure a standardization of approach and timing, and for sure and timing related to the authorization of new products with many advantages, stimulating, facilitating the development of scientific technology and facilitating and speed up patient treatment. So I agree with the caution that Giulio had about the different regulation and timing.
Absolutely. And that brings me back, Andrew, and if I could come back to you, I stopped you in mid-flow on the details of the EU level mechanism that you were calling for in order to advise member states on which legal framework applies. And there's a question from our audience linked to this, and I'd like, hang on a second, hang on. I just want to also alert Stefan, because I'm going to bring him in with a question from our audience that says, after I've given you the floor, Andrula, what will the impact of the review of the legislation be? Is there a risk that some products are viewed as BTC in some countries and as ATMP in others? Who will be in charge of advising member states on which framework applies? But Andrula, This EU level mechanism, how do you think it should work and why does it matter?
Well, first of all, it's very clear that we need to resolve gray areas, and we need to know where, in which class each of the product development belongs to, so that it can go under the right regulation. But another very important point why a pan-European mechanism needs to be developed is that the same interpretations on this apply to every member state, because if a country chooses that this belongs to BTC and another country decides that it belongs to ATMP, then developers have immense challenges, but also there are challenges in the quality standards and the consistency. And I'm referring both to the centralized manufacturing process as well as the decentralized, that all need to fall under this. For the patients, it's an absolute necessity to have clear under which regulatory and standards the product is falling under.
Thank you. And Stefan, in your presentation earlier, you're very much underlining the objective here is legal clarity. You talked about understanding the borderline. You talked about the criteria. Some sort of EU level mechanism who will advise either in a binding way or a non-binding way member states on which legal framework. How would it work? Do you support what Andrula is talking about, which is a mechanism to do this that would be binding?
That's of course the dream we all have. I think look at what's happening in the UK. The one-stop shop there, I think, is indeed the model where pharma, device, and transplant authorities are coming together and then give common advice to all the developers. It is not so easy, unfortunately, in the EU because of two reasons. We have 3 different EU legal frameworks on 3 different sectors: pharma, medical devices, transplants, that each have their own framework, and it's not so easy to go on top of that. But I think at least with what we are planning in the BTC revision, we take a good step forward to that, because as said before, there was never a central place in the BTC framework to discuss. Now there will be a central place, and it will be a place that connects and interacts where needed with those places that do the same in the pharma framework and the medical device framework. The second reason why it is difficult is because in the EU, in the end, the final decision on what are the applicable rules is at the member state level. And that also, to the question that was given to me, that is de facto the current situation. Member states today are coming to different conclusions on similar therapies. And by putting our heads together, so at EU level, we can only give advice. We cannot take the decisions. But by putting our heads together and try to coordinate and come as much as possible with common views, we will much more influence that. Also, the member states come to the same discussion. So it's all about, I think, A, coordinating, and B, making sure that the right experts are all involved. And I think bodies like the Committee on Advanced Therapy have their very important role to play.
Thank you. Anyone want to react on that?
I just wanted to mention that the inclusion of such an advisory report in the legislation will help competent authorities at the national level, just by including this recommendation.
Just wanted to raise a related issue about decentralized manufacturing and what are the implications of that trend for the regulatory framework? Seen as a way to unlock patient access, but does it raise any important issues for you? Can anybody help us with that issue? Giulio, is it possible?
Well, we've been discussing with the Accademia dei Lincei, and we have also involved many charities like Teleton or Duchenne Parent Project in this discussion. And as usual, the diagnosis is relatively simple. The therapy is more complicated. So that, because I think this should happen at 2 levels. One level should be the national level, where somehow one should get, and in moments like that, obviously, it's not so easy to attract the attention of the government or even the Ministry of Health in such a complicated and just post-pandemic situation. But in any case, sensibilize, I noticed that at least in Italy and in UK, where I spend most of my time, not only common people, but many medical doctors have no idea whatsoever, A, that this therapy exists, and B, that there is the risk that may not be administered, the few that work, because we don't have to forget that the majority do not work yet. And this should somehow create a kind of general opinion that may influence the government. At the same time, I think through the Federation of the European Medical Academy, through other bodies like this, where I have the, I've been the pleasure of participating today, it should be important to create some kind of European, at least European pressure, so that the problem is simple. Michele De Luca has a GMP facility in Modena with 15 rooms. He has the personal train. The Italian government, with very little money for, especially when the disease is rare, could pay for the therapy. And obviously this would need a committee that decide which therapy really worked to avoid that anybody trying to jump on the winning chariot. That's my vague idea, but obviously we still have the phase that we talk to each other and try to argue what could be the best way, but for sure should happen at the national and the European level simultaneously. That's my idea at the moment.
And sorry, just to add,
yes,
that the existing legal framework should consider this new approach. We cannot allow without any kind of framework, of legal framework, I mean that of the centralized manufacturing, because it is the current trend of scientific evidence, and of course we must be open to an assessment of this impact in terms of sustainability.
Thank you very much. Just want to read out a quick comment from the audience before we move on. For harmonization between national authorities, I don't have a name of who's making this comment, but the audience member says, for harmonization between national authorities, I think the MHRA one-stop shop can be used as a point of inspiration. The UK has a high success rate in bringing ATMPs into clinical trials, and they are extremely dedicated to supporting scientists to bring products forward to initial trials. I think the EU should aim to be an equally attractive place to conduct those trials. Links together many of the issues we've been discussing all afternoon. Thank you all very much. Andre, before I close this quickfire panel, your reaction to what you've heard, and would you identify a key priority in this area to make sure we get the legal clarity that Stefan was talking about, and within the limits of what the EU can do in this area, we tackle this fragmentation issue?
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, indeed, I have two takeaways. So yeah, the regulatory clarity is needed. Harmonization and the unification among the member states regulatory authorities is a dream that we want to achieve one day. And as a minimal activity and a step forward is to include in the legislation kind of a key which can be used in order to make the clear decision. So this is the first takeaway. And the second takeaway, I don't know how to directly link it, but for me it sounded really very interesting. And this is that we are in EU facing risk of withdrawal of ATMPs from the market, which decreases the patient's access to the transformative therapies. So definitely this is something to which we need to pay special attention when going through the legislative work. So these are my two key takeaways. Hopefully I listened carefully.
Thank you. And as you say, Anna Hildalgo, Simon, highlighting that key issue of not only getting them to market, but keeping them on the market being very crucial. Andre, thank you to you very much. And thank you to all our panel for a great discussion. I wish we had twice as long, but I did at the beginning mention this was a bit of a whistle-stop tour because so many issues to discuss. Thank you very much indeed. But before we close this event, by way of some conclusions, some next steps, I'm going to show a video now from Nicolas Gonzalez Casares, MEP, who's another MEP member of the interest group, with some reflections on towards an MEP charter to enable safe and timely patient access to ATMPs. So let's hear what he has to say.
Firstly, as member of the Transfer MEP interest group, I would like to extend my thanks to all speakers and interveners for sharing your perspectives today, as the revision of the blood, tissues and cells and general pharmaceuticals legislation files will soon be discussed in Parliament. It is an important moment to have this discussion among experts and understand how parliamentarians can ensure the EU framework support patients getting access to these transformative therapies. Unfortunately, I was not able to join the event live today, but I was fortunate to meet with members of the Transfer Alliance recently to discuss their policy, ask for the ATMP regulatory framework, and exchange ideas on the challenge and explore solutions to make sure the EU legislation is fit for purpose for ATMPs. Therefore, I would like to draw some general conclusions on the topic and also look to the future. Our collective objective is clear: to ensure patient safety and maintain quality and efficacy standards in the delivery of advanced therapies. For this, given that ATMPs are very complex, non-conventional medicines, having a robust regulatory framework for ATMPs marketing authorization, monitoring, and administration is critical. At the same time, this must be balanced against the need to ensure that Europe remains a hub for clinical trials with ATMPs, that innovative therapies are assessed taking into account their specificities, and where appropriate, they are swiftly approved to enable timely patient access. I would like also to note the need to leverage the European health data space to support data interoperability, which serves the wider regulatory ecosystem by enabling real-world evidence to be used in assessment decisions. Real-world evidence is particularly pertinent for ATMPs, given their unique nature and a small patient population, which means that different forms of data generation other than traditional designed clinical trials are often needed. I and the other members of the Transfer MEP interest group will be reviewing the forthcoming legislation proposals that touch on the regulatory framework for ATMPs with these points in mind. Having the Transfer Alliance input on this test is of immense value, as the hard work has been done to hammer our consensus in key topics amongst those stakeholders in the field. I look forward to continued engagement with you all in the coming months. As a final reminder, the transfer policy asks on regulatory framework for ATMPs have now been published on the website. We are working to ensure a safe, science-based, and future-proof ATMP regulatory framework that is agile, flexible, and proportionate to the associated level of risk. I would like to conclude by looking ahead to our plans for the rest of the year. And it is my pleasure to invite you to the European Parliament on the 13th of October at 2 p.m. for the in-person launch of an MEP charter outlining the key policy asks across the two strands of war that Transfer has developed in 2022. Safe and daily access to authorized ATMP and appropriate regulatory framework. Transfer is a crucial forum to discuss among experts and policymakers the steps needed to ensure patients have access to these therapies and the forefront of medical innovation. Please do continue to follow the work of Transfer on Twitter, LinkedIn, and on behalf of the Transfer MEP Interest Group, we look forward to continuing this conversation with you all. Thank you.
So we heard there from Nicolas Gonzalez Casares. And may I add, I look forward, I hope, to seeing all of you in person for the first time in this series in October for the launch of that MEP Charter, which will be finalized and formalized, taking into account the discussions we've had today and at the March event, drawing on those key points that have been made by all our wonderful and inspiring speakers. I really want to thank them very much for their very rich inputs and also for bearing with me as we took that whistle-stop tour around some very detailed and complex issues. I'm really very grateful to all of you, and thank you to all of you for joining us, for your questions and comments. And it only remains for me to wish you all a very pleasant rest of the day. So thank you all very much indeed, and goodbye.